Between 1945 and 1954, France waged a relentless war more than 9,000 kilometers away from Paris. A conflict marked by backroom deals, betrayals, idealistic dreams, and crushing disillusionment. It was a battle driven by the dual forces of freedom and oppression, a struggle that held both hope and heartache. The war ravaged a country, claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and ultimately signaled the beginning of the end for the French colonial empire. This multifaceted conflict was a colonial war, a war for independence, and a Cold War battleground all rolled into one. Yet today, it has largely faded from public memory. By the 1930s, France ruled over a vast colonial empire that spanned across Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Oceania, covering nearly 11 million square kilometers and home to more than 50 million people. French Indochina, comprising Laos, Cambodia, and the three Vietnamese regions of Tonkin, Annam, and Cochinchina, was considered the crown jewel of this empire. France had maintained control over the region for more than 70 years, basking in its prestige and profits. In the streets of Saigon, Hanoi, and Hue, familiar scenes unfolded day after day. The French colonists, numbering around 36,000, lived in relative luxury, enjoying European standards of living while conducting business deals in the open-air cafes. Their wives resided in a parallel world, detached from the realities faced by the majority of the local population. For many French citizens, Indochina was seen as the model colony. Yet the picture was starkly different for the 23 million Indo-Chinese. While vaccination efforts reduced mortality rates and the emerging middle class benefited somewhat from French presence, many Vietnamese labored in mines, factories, and farms under harsh conditions. Although slavery had officially been abolished, brutal forms of exploitation persisted. The colonial administration extracted valuable resources, ores, timber, coal, tea, rice, and especially rubber, from the land, which enriched industrial giants like Michelin. Rubber production in Vietnam was a booming industry, and French plantations, particularly owned by the Michelin Company, profited enormously. Workers, however, faced brutal conditions, with many dying from overwork, disease, or malnutrition. A common saying of the time captured the stark reality of this exploitation. The rubber tree leaves are a magnificent green, each tree nourished by the corpses of the workers. Any form of resistance to this exploitative system was met with severe punishment. However, the course of history changed in 1940 when the Japanese army occupied much of Indochina. Although the French administration technically remained in place, the Japanese quickly assumed control, exploiting the colony on an unprecedented scale. For the Vietnamese, this meant enduring the oppression of two imperial powers, an unsustainable situation that led to rising tensions. Amid this upheaval, the Vietnamese liberation movement found itself at the forefront of resistance. One of its key leaders was Nguyen Quoc, born in 1890. An experienced revolutionary, he had been active in a predecessor to the Socialist Party before co-founding the French Communist Party. His journey took him through the revolutionary circles of Paris, Moscow, and Beijing, where he honed his ideology. By 1941, after adopting the name Ho Chi Minh, he had become one of the founders of the Vietnamese Communist Party. To avoid detection by authorities, Ho Chi Minh frequently changed his name. But in 1941, he settled on the alias he would use for the rest of his life. That same year, he founded the Viet Minh, a league dedicated to achieving independence for Vietnam. Now 50 years old, Ho Chi Minh was waiting for the perfect moment to push for Vietnam's freedom, and in March 1945 it came. With the end of World War II in sight, and both Germany and Japan on the verge of defeat, the Japanese sought to drive the French out of Indochina. They attacked French colonists, imprisoning many soldiers in camps in an effort to eradicate French control from the region. In 1945, as the tides of war shifted in the Pacific, Japan granted nominal independence to the three Indo-Chinese nations. In Cambodia, the young King Norodom Sihanouk declared independence, while in Laos, King Sisavang Vong took the throne. In Vietnam, Emperor Bao Dai announced independence as well. However, this independence was in name only, as the real power remained firmly in the hands of the Japanese occupiers. Despite the proclamations, French Indochina, as it had been known, ceased to exist. By May 1945, following nearly 6 years of devastating conflict, Nazi Germany surrendered, and the war in Europe came to an end. While many nations celebrated victory, the battle in the Pacific raged on. The Japanese forces, still entrenched across the region, continued to offer fierce resistance. For the United States, defeating Japan required gathering intelligence, especially on Japanese troop movements still occupying regions like Indochina. During this period, Ho Chi Minh recognized an opportunity. With the Americans maintaining an anti-colonial stance, he sought their assistance in combating the Japanese. He offered his forces, though small, to help the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA, which was actively working in the region. In exchange for the invaluable intelligence provided by the Viet Minh, the United States offered weapons and training to about 200 of Ho Chi Minh's fighters. Major Archimedes Patty, head of the OSS in Indochina, later reflected on the collaboration, stating, although they were Marxists, the real aim of these Viet Minh guerrillas was to fight the Japs, and that was the primary objective of our plan. This unexpected partnership was captured in photographs, showing Ho Chi Minh smiling alongside American officers, a reminder of an alliance that would seem unthinkable 2 decades later when both nations found themselves embroiled in the Vietnam War. The turning point came just a few months later. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan's unconditional surrender. For Ho Chi Minh, this marked a golden opportunity. With Japanese forces withdrawing and the French yet to return, the path to Vietnamese independence was wide open. Ho Chi Minh called on his supporters to seize control of government buildings, and Emperor Bao Dai was deposed. On September 2, 1945, in a momentous speech in Hanoi's Ba Dinh Square, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed the independence of Vietnam. He declared to the world, throughout the last 80 years, the French imperialists, abusing the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, have violated our ancestral land and oppressed our countrymen. For these reasons, we, the Provisional Government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, solemnly declare to the world that Vietnam has the right to be free and independent, and in fact has become free and independent. With the Vietnamese flag flying high, Ho Chi Minh became a national hero, affectionately known as Uncle Ho. His immense popularity united the people, giving them a sense of pride and freedom that had been denied for generations. As one schoolboy reflected, after 60 years of bearing the dishonor of foreign domination, we had our president and a declaration of independence, just like every other free country in the world. A young man captured the sentiment of the day in his diary. Today we're free. Free to laugh, to sing, to live independently. Free to cry and suffer for the country of our fathers. However, this declaration of independence was viewed quite differently in France. Charles de Gaulle, then the president of the Provisional Government, considered the move illegitimate. France had no intention of allowing a colonial rebellion to dictate its future. Restoring the French Empire, particularly in Indochina, was a top priority. De Gaulle quickly dispatched a celebrated World War II hero, General Philippe Leclerc de Hautecloque, to Indochina with 45,000 troops to reclaim the colony from the Viet Minh. Leclerc, a decorated general who had liberated cities like Paris and Strasbourg, now turned his attention to Saigon and Hanoi. His forces rapidly launched military operations, dismissing any possibility of a diplomatic solution. For France, the time for negotiations was over. The fate of Indochina would be decided by military force. Ho Chi Minh, pragmatic in his approach, understood the daunting odds he faced in open warfare against the French. As a result, he entered into negotiations, agreeing to allow the French military to return to Vietnam under certain conditions. For Leclerc's troops, many of whom had been part of the 2nd Armored Division that had marched triumphantly into Paris, liberating Saigon felt like reliving their earlier victories. For the French colonists, who had suffered under Japanese rule, this was a moment of salvation. They welcomed their liberators with open arms, excited by the restoration of French authority. But peace remained elusive. The reconquest of Vietnam by the French did not bring an end to the fighting. To resolve the ongoing conflict, negotiations were necessary. In 1946, Ho Chi Minh traveled to France with a glimmer of hope, believing that he could reach an agreement with his former colonial rulers. Upon his arrival in France, he was greeted warmly by a delegation of Vietnamese expatriates. In a speech delivered in flawless French, Ho Chi Minh appealed to the shared values of the French and Vietnamese people. My French brothers, we, French and Vietnamese, have the same ideals: liberty, equality, and fraternity. We are pursuing the same goal: democracy and peace. That's why I am sure that France and Vietnam will be able to understand each other and build an equal, loyal, and friendly collaboration. 2 weeks later, on July 6, 1946, negotiations commenced at the Fontainebleau Conference. Prime Minister Georges Bidault, seen here on the left, warmly welcomed the Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh. However, the talks quickly took a sour turn. Barely after Ho Chi Minh had left Saigon, the High Commissioner in Indochina, Thierry Dargieu, declared the creation of an autonomous republic of Cochinchina. This region, the wealthiest in Vietnam, where most French colonists and businesses were based, was crucial to Vietnam's economic future. Dargieu made the declaration without consulting Paris, a severe betrayal of Ho Chi Minh's goals, as he had laid claim to all of Vietnam. This move dealt a devastating blow to the talks, causing immediate distrust. Despite their efforts, the conference ended in failure. A Vietnamese negotiator noted, "We agreed on only one thing, and that was that we agreed on nothing." However, Ho Chi Minh did not leave France empty-handed. The negotiations elevated his international stature and gave him a platform to voice Vietnam's grievances. He issued a defiant statement: "If we have to fight, we will fight. You'll kill 10 of us, and we'll kill just one of you, but in the end, you'll be the ones who get tired." This marked a critical turning point, signaling his readiness to continue the fight for independence at all costs. The situation escalated dramatically on November 23, 1946, when the French Navy bombarded the port city of Haiphong. This was triggered by clashes between Vietnamese police and French soldiers following the seizure of a Viet Minh cargo boat. A young boy, Phan Tam, who was 14 years old at the time, later recalled, "Haiphong was known as the city of red blazes in May because of the blooming trees. But in November, the red came from the fires, not the flowers." Over 6,000 Vietnamese, mostly civilians, perished in the attack, intensifying anti-colonial sentiment. Ho Chi Minh retaliated just a month later, on December 19, 1946, by calling for a general uprising against the French. "He who has a gun, let him use his gun. He who has a sword, let him use his sword. Let everyone fight colonialism," he declared. Hanoi was soon engulfed in flames, as French nationals were killed and buildings looted. This set off a chain of escalating violence, and the French army began shelling Hanoi continuously. By February 1947, French forces had regained control of the capital. But Ho Chi Minh and his fighters had retreated into the difficult-to-navigate border region with China, where they would continue their resistance. Thus began the First Indochina War. At this critical juncture, France was in political turmoil. Following Charles de Gaulle's resignation, France had gone through 5 governments in just 2 years. The constant instability hindered decisive action. General Leclerc warned that to win the war, France would need to commit 500,000 soldiers. If not, we might as well grant them independence now and save ourselves from a war we cannot win, he advised. His warnings were ignored, and in 1947, Paul Ramadier's government pressed forward, announcing, "We will end the war as soon as there is order and security." However, this was a stalling tactic, as no French government wanted to relinquish Indochina, a critical part of their colonial empire. Meanwhile, the French Far East Expeditionary Corps in Indochina had about 100,000 soldiers, many of whom were volunteers seeking adventure, defending their homeland, or simply looking for promotions. In contrast, Ho Chi Minh had only 60,000 men, highly motivated but poorly equipped. Despite being outnumbered, within just a month, the French regained control over large parts of the territory. One French soldier wrote home, "It's unbelievable. Our enemy seems to vanish into thin air. This feels like the perfect military expedition." Yet, despite their superior numbers, the French struggled to pin down their elusive foe. Ho Chi Minh's forces, under the command of General Vong Nguyen Giap, adapted to these conditions. Giap, a former history teacher with a profound hatred for colonialism, had personal reasons for his fight. His first wife had died in a French prison, and his sister-in-law had been executed for her communist activism. Giap understood that his forces couldn't defeat the French in conventional warfare. Instead, they turned to guerrilla tactics, exploiting their intimate knowledge of the dense jungles and difficult terrain. Ho Chi Minh likened the struggle to a tiger fighting an elephant. If the tiger doesn't move, the elephant will pierce it with its tusks. But the tiger must keep moving, striking fast and hard, before disappearing. The Viet Minh's strategy revolved around rapid, surprise attacks followed by swift retreats into the jungles, where they were impossible to track. For the French, this war became a nightmare. One French corporal confided, "The hidden traps that pierce our feet are our worst fear. Every wound gets infected, every injury saps our morale. Each time it happens, 2 or 3 of us are called to transport the injured. It's exhausting." The guerrilla tactics and lack of a conventional battlefield made the conflict deeply unsettling. "This is nothing like what we were taught at St. Cyr," admitted one captain. "Our material superiority means little in this terrain." As the war dragged on, French troops, harassed and isolated, resorted to increasingly brutal tactics. In their frustration, they turned to random acts of revenge. Sergeant Jean-Claude Masson wrote to his fiancée about one such incident. "The first village we encountered was burned to the ground. We didn't wait for them to start. No, we burned it down first. The men were taken as prisoners, and the women were given fur coats as a cruel joke." On November 29, 1947, the French army entered the village of Mai Can in southern Vietnam, killing 286 civilians in a single massacre. These brutal reprisals only deepened the Vietnamese people's hatred for the French. One survivor, Song In, who had been struck by a French bullet as a teenager, recalled, "I don't remember thinking about anything other than killing the French. We all thought like that. When we grew up, we'd kill the French." The violence of the colonial army only swelled the ranks of the Viet Minh, as more and more young men and women joined the resistance. Although the war was grueling, it had its profiteers. War profiteers emerged, including sex workers, arms dealers, merchants, and shopkeepers, who traded in everything from opium to weapons. Even currencies were exploited, with French businessmen buying Indochinese piastres at 10 francs and selling them in France at the official rate of 17 francs, pocketing the difference. One Frenchman, working in the import-export business, cynically remarked, "How many more good years can we squeeze out of this war?" 2 years after the conflict in Vietnam began to escalate, the situation remained volatile. Despite several attacks by the Viet Minh, the French authorities displayed a troubling lack of concern. In 1947, the National Defense Minister boldly proclaimed that there was no longer a military problem in Indochina, declaring that the success of French forces was total. This statement proved to be a devastating miscalculation. Across the globe, colonial empires were rapidly crumbling. Britain had already relinquished control of India, Ceylon, and Burma, and the Netherlands was on the verge of letting go of Indonesia. French leaders, while aware of the shifting tides, clung fiercely to their empire, particularly to Vietnam, a colony they considered the crown jewel. France's desire to retain its colonial holdings was driven not just by national pride, but by economic interests. Investments by French companies in access to Vietnam's raw materials were seen as too vital to abandon. Determined to delay the inevitable loss of its territory and halt the spread of communism, the French devised a political strategy. They hoped to weaken Ho Chi Minh's popular support by rallying around a well-known figure in Vietnamese history, Bao Dai, the former emperor. In 1945, Bao Dai had briefly supported the Japanese occupation of Vietnam before abdicating. Now, France saw him as a potential leader who could lend credibility to a French-controlled, nominally independent Vietnam. In 1947, Bao Dai arrived at Ha Long Bay to meet with Émile Bollard, the High Commissioner of France in Indochina. The meeting was touted as a possible turning point in the politics of Indochina, as France hoped to use Bao Dai's status to legitimize their control over Vietnam. However, Bao Dai, often referred to as the nightclub emperor due to his preference for leisure and luxury, was reluctant to assume the role of head of state. His hesitancy caused Paris to lose precious time, while Ho Chi Minh's influence continued to grow. While the French pinned their hopes on Bao Dai, Ho Chi Minh focused on building mass support among the Vietnamese people. In 1948, the Viet Minh launched their first major patriotic campaign, a common tool in the communist world. The goal was to solidify their hold on rural communities. The party organized competitions where villages that contributed the most rice, clothing, or meat to the Viet Minh fighters were awarded certificates of patriotism. Political commissars traveled through the countryside, spreading the Viet Minh message and bolstering their ranks. By 1948, the Viet Minh had grown to 400,000 fighters. The surge in recruitment allowed the communist leadership to shift from guerrilla tactics to more conventional military operations. On March 1, 1948, they ambushed a French convoy on the road between Saigon and Dalat. The attack was a disaster for the French, leaving nearly 100 soldiers dead and over 200 captured. The scale of the defeat shocked France and increased domestic criticism of the war. In France, the Communist Party, one of the country's most powerful political forces, vocally opposed the war. They branded it a dirty war that served the interests of finance and big business. Their slogan, "Not one man, not one penny for the Vietnam War," resonated with a growing portion of the French public. In the context of the Cold War, where Moscow's influence was profound, opposition to the war intensified. Dock workers went on strike to block the shipment of arms to Indochina, and communist activists secretly filmed the grim scenes no one wanted to acknowledge: the daily unloading of coffins containing French soldiers, hidden from public view. As the war dragged on, the French leadership found itself increasingly unsettled. Public confidence was faltering, and the escalating violence in Indochina was taking a heavy toll on both the military and morale. Yet, despite these warning signs, France remained determined to hold on to its empire, refusing to confront the growing strength of the Viet Minh and the reality of a conflict that was far from being resolved. By late 1949, After 3 years of conflict, France had failed to crush the Viet Minh, despite its military superiority. The French, now realizing that a purely military solution was unattainable, finally granted symbolic independence to Vietnam, installing former Emperor Bao Dai as the head of state. However, this so-called independence was a mere facade. Paris retained control over key areas such as defense, currency, foreign policy, and trade, believing that these gestures would calm the situation. The French Minister of War optimistically declared, "We're finally out of the tunnel." But this proclamation was far from the truth. The Viet Minh had grown stronger, consolidating its hold on Vietnam, especially in the north. Vong Nguyen Giap and Ho Chi Minh continued to expand their armies, transforming companies into battalions and battalions into regiments. For the past 3 years, France had consistently been a step behind, stubbornly clinging to its colonial power. By refusing to relinquish any control, France was on the path to losing everything. In October 1949, a major shift in the balance of power occurred. On the 1st of that month, the Communists seized power in China, and Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic. For Ho Chi Minh, this was a monumental development. Communist China, now an ideological ally, began supplying the Viet Minh with weapons, military experts, and sanctuary. Giap's forces could now train in safety, away from French attacks, and China's material support gave the Viet Minh a significant advantage in the conflict. As the world entered the Cold War, the spread of communism in Asia alarmed the United States. The U.S. had long opposed colonialism, but with the communist victory in China, President Harry Truman reconsidered his stance. His administration now saw Vietnam not as a colonial struggle, but as a front in the fight against communist expansion. Truman pledged support to France, rebranding the colonial war as a fight against communist aggression. In doing so, he solidified America's commitment to containing Soviet influence across the globe. For France, Mao's victory was a devastating shock. French strategists responded by abandoning several fortified positions along the Chinese border, believing them to be too vulnerable. But the evacuation of Chao Bang, a key military outpost, proved disastrous. On October 3, 1950, Giap launched a large-scale attack on French forces. The Battle of Route Coloniale 4 lasted for several days and ended in catastrophe for the French. Nearly 5,000 French soldiers were lost in a matter of 2 weeks, and thousands more were taken prisoner. Those who survived were haunted by the memory of the battle. One French soldier recalled the terror. They were shooting from above, to the left and right. Men were dropping like flies. I left dozens of wounded behind, calling out for their mothers in every language. The battle was a turning point. The French military, in panic, abandoned more bases and surrendered tons of valuable hardware to the Viet Minh without a fight. With control of the northern border, the Viet Minh could now receive a steady supply of Chinese weapons and equipment. France's leaders, however, remained in denial, with official news bulletins claiming that the situation was under control. But back home, public opinion was rapidly shifting. The French Communist Party intensified its protests, calling for an end to what they termed a bloody war in Indochina. Their efforts resonated with the growing anti-war sentiment. The movement spread, with dock workers, railroad employees, and even typists joining the protests. One young woman, Raymond Diane, was arrested for lying in front of a train carrying military supplies to Vietnam. In another widely publicized case, communist activist Henri Martin, a former Navy volunteer, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for distributing anti-war leaflets. His imprisonment galvanized public outrage, and the Communist Party organized defense committees, portraying Martin and others as martyrs of the anti-war cause. The artistic and intellectual world also rallied behind the movement. Figures like Pablo Picasso immortalized these young protesters, and the Communist Party brought the issue to the National Assembly. There, Deputy Pierre Mendès France delivered a fiery speech, calling for an end to the conflict and urging his fellow lawmakers to accept the truth. We simply don't have the means to achieve the military victory we've been hoping for. Have the courage to face the truth and tell the country. However, Mendès France's plea fell on deaf ears. René Pleven, the 11th prime minister since the start of the war, refused to consider negotiations with the Viet Minh. To the French government, making peace with Ho Chi Minh meant accepting communist victory, which they believed would be a betrayal of their allies fighting communism in Korea. Despite the devastation at Chao Bang, France's leaders, blinded by Cold War geopolitics, pressed on with the war in a desperate bid to restore their military's shattered reputation and morale. What France needed now was new leadership and a fresh strategy. But the cost of this delay was only beginning to unfold.